You are Locked On College Basketball, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
All right, Isaac, we're going to talk some bubble watch stuff here. We're only a week away from March. We're only a few weeks away from Selection Sunday, from getting this field of 68 officially locked in and loaded. And we got quite a few teams that did some really impressive, helpful things for their NCAA tournament resumes, and some teams that maybe went in the wrong direction. I want to start with a big-time win from the team still coached by Mike Woodson. I was going to say formerly coached. No, he's still there. Indiana, the Hoosiers, move up to 16-11 overall, 5-9 in the Big Ten with a monster 15-point win at home over the Boilermakers of Purdue. And look, there's a conversation to be had about Purdue, who has definitely been in a bit of a skid as of late, but this is a huge win for Indiana, a team that has kind of sputtered throughout the season, that's been the butt of a lot of jokes for the roster construction, for, kind of the decision to not move on from Mike Woodson last year and potentially bring in Dusty May, and the success that Dusty May has had at Michigan. But in a game that Indiana really needed to win to keep their chances of being an NCAA tournament team alive, they went out and got it done. And they did it with Umar Ballo and Mackenzie Mbako coming off the bench. They'd lost 5 straight before they beat both Michigan State and Purdue in their last 3 games. And that loss to UCLA, I think it might hurt them, but they were so close to picking that one up. That would have been a really impressive stretch if they'd been able to get that one. But they also nearly beat Michigan. This is a team that's played some good basketball, really, since Woodson. They kind of messed up the way that they announced Mike Woodson's decision, and that caused some controversy. But really, since then, they've played some pretty inspired basketball. And at this point, I think they still got a little bit of work to do. They got a road swing out to Washington and at Oregon. They got Ohio State at home. Washington isn't a team they should struggle with, but that road trip is tough. And you really need to win both of those. I think you can stomach a loss at Oregon if you beat Washington, if you beat Ohio State, if you beat Penn State, one of their other games coming up. You gotta go 3-1 in that stretch. And I think realistically, you got to go 3-1. And I think the only loss you really feel comfortable taking is that loss in Eugene. But this team is in a position to go 500 in conference play and potentially get in the NCAA tournament, which I didn't think we'd be having that conversation a few weeks ago.
I didn't either. Nice resurrection here from the Hoosiers in the post-Mike Woodson era. Lame duck Mike Woodson. Also, speaking of Oregon, what a comeback from them on Saturday to kind of kick things off. Andy, next winner we got to mention, John Calipari's Hogs, 92-85 at home over number 15 Mizzou. And I tell you, these Tigers have been hot, Andy. And so for them to come in and Arkansas to knock them off in Bud Walton moves the Hogs to 16-11 overall. Still just 5-9 in SEC play. I'm really curious to see what the committee does with these SEC teams, so many of which are going to have losing records. For Arkansas, they would have had they lost this game, it would have been a 3-game skid. It would have been a 4 out of 5 situation. But now they win this, and similar to what you just said about Indiana, have a pretty manageable closing schedule as SEC schedules go. Maybe get themselves to 500 in SEC play. Next, they host Texas. Then they're at South Carolina, which, ask those Longhorns, is not an easy place to play. Yeah. We'll talk about them in a second. Then they're at Vandy. That might be the toughest game left. And then they host Mississippi State. Mississippi State is better to me than Vandy, but going to Nashville, I think, and you got to just climb up to that court. That wears my legs out, Andy. It's a whole thing. Good for the Hogs on this win this weekend.
Speaking of Mississippi State, they take a loss to Oklahoma, who is now up to 17-10 overall, but only 4-10 in the SEC. This team is one of the more fascinating teams in terms of the bubble conversation, and picking up this win, I think, helps with that, because 3-11, even if they won the rest, 3-11 is just really hard to stomach a team with that record. Not that 4-10 is much better, but the win over Mississippi State helps Oklahoma, a team that did not lose a game in the non-conference, that picked up marquee wins over teams like Arizona, and they had some, I think they beat Michigan. They had another big win in the regular season, or in the non-conference as well. But this is a team that has really struggled in the SEC. This kind of is exactly what happened to Porter Moser's team last year. But this SEC is so strong that with a couple of good non-conference wins, and every win that you get in the conference being a pretty good win, this team is actually putting together a resume that I think keeps them in the conversation. They got this one. You need to win at home. They beat a ranked team at home in Mississippi State. I think this keeps them in at least that play-in conversation, but their schedule is tough. They got Kentucky at home. They got a road trip to Ole Miss. They got Mizzou at home, and then they got a road trip to Texas. That's a really brutal final stretch. You're 4-10, folks. You're 4-14. You're not making the tournament. If you're 6-12, normally I'd say no, but honestly, maybe that's enough to get Oklahoma in. It'll be very interesting to see how the committee again treats a team that far below 500, but in this kind of conference.
So there's our biggest bubble winners of the weekend: Indiana, Arkansas, and Oklahoma. We could say BYU, Andy, but we don't have to because they've been playing so well lately. I wouldn't even call them a bubble winner. They're just a general winner. Let's move to our biggest losers of the weekend from a bubble standpoint, I guess I should say. Andy, we're going to start with the Wake Forest Demon Deacons, who go on the road to NC State and lose to the Wolfpack 85-73. By the way, for ACC bubble teams not named North Carolina, it was a bad weekend. It wasn't just Wake, it was SMU and Pitt also losing. Wake is now 19-8, 11-5 overall. And Andy, here's the hard part for the Demon Deacons. As recently as 3 games ago, they were sitting at 18-6, 10-3 in the ACC. And all 6 of their losses were to probable or at least potential tournament teams. But they've lost 2 of their last 3, that absolute collapse against Florida State. And then this game against NC State. The FSU loss is their first and only Q3 loss. And then the NC State loss, since it was on the road, is a Q2, but barely. Like NC State is just barely inside Q2 on the road right there. And so, Andy, they had no losses outside of Q1. Now they have one in Q2 and Q3. Here's the good news, though, if you're Steve Forbes' team. 3 of their final 4 are at home, and that's against Virginia, Notre Dame, and Georgia Tech. Watch out for them. We know how they can jump up against some teams, so they can't mess those up. Those are must-wins. And then they get their big shot. They get to go to Duke. The nice thing about that is it's kind of a, if you win, it's awesome. If you lose, you're supposed to because it's inside Cameron. So, Andy, if I'm Wake Forest, I need to go 3-1, and that loss can only be at Duke.
Yeah, with Wake, I think the strength of their resume was not having any Q2, Q3, Q4 losses. To have picked up 2 in their last 3 games, really brutal turn of events for Steve Forbes' team. Speaking of teams on losing streaks, Ohio State, we have them as one of the biggest losers in terms of the bubble conversation, in part because of what happened both on Thursday and on Sunday. They're now 15-13, 7-10 in the Big Ten because they lost both their games over the weekend. They lost at UCLA on Sunday. It was an 8-point loss to UCLA on the road. That in a vacuum, not terrible. You'd like to pick that one up, but UCLA is a good team. It's a road game. It was a close game from the metrics. It doesn't hurt you that much. The problem is that on Thursday, Ohio State hosted Northwestern and got their bell rung. 70-49, got beat by 21 points at their home floor by a team that's not going to sniff the NCAA tournament. That makes the UCLA loss, it exacerbates everything. It's just, now you've lost 3 in a row. You've lost 4 of your last 5. You lost 5 of your last 7 games. You've got again, if you want to take a silver lining, I guess, for Ohio State, they're closing against mostly bubble-ish teams. If you win out, not only do you strengthen your resume, you can get up to 500 in the conference, but you also knock the resume of a few other teams that you're competing with to get a spot. They're at USC, then they host Nebraska, then they're at Indiana. So they got some chances to knock off some teams that would really help them. But those 2 losses this last weekend really put a damper on Ohio State's chances of getting to the big dance.
It's that classic thing. You can't lose a home game you're supposed to win before you go on the road. Andy, the third team that was our big bubble loser of the weekend, unfortunately, is West Virginia. It's been a great story with, not big expectations coming into the year, but they've done so well. And they lose Tucker DeVries, and boy, could they have used him in Lubbock, Texas on Saturday, Andy. West Virginia falls to 16-11, 7-9 in Big 12 play, got blitzed in Lubbock 73-51. Again, a game that they're not expected to win, but you want to keep it close and respectable. They did not. Similar to a couple of teams, though, Andy, on the winner side that we just mentioned, West Virginia does have a pretty manageable closing schedule as Big 12 schedules go. They host TCU, they're at BYU, at Utah, and then they host UCF. Same kind of thing. You probably need to go 3-1 there, with the lone loss specifically being at BYU. They can't do what the Kansas schools did and go get swept on the Utah stretch, right? Got to win those 2 home games and need to win at Utah. And then you're just playing with house money at BYU. Andy, there were a couple honorable mention losers for us. Who were those?
Yeah, Baylor is a team that isn't really considered on the bubble yet, but you can't lose at Colorado. Colorado was 1-14 in the Big 12, in the Big 12 before Baylor loses that game to them. That is a brutal loss for Baylor. They're not in that conversation yet, but wow, that is not helping Scott Drew's team at all. Texas loses at South Carolina, a team that had a worse record than Colorado even. They had not won an SEC game prior to beating Texas. That's a bad loss for Rodney Terry's team. And then San Diego State, they lost at Utah State. It's not a bad loss. It was an 8-point game too. They didn't get blown out, but it's not a killer for San Diego State, but it just puts more pressure on the rest of their schedule. They got New Mexico coming into town. It'd be really great to win that game, to beat them. But if you don't, you still got to take care of business at Wyoming. You got to take care of business at UNLV, and you got to beat Nevada at home. If you can win those games, even if you lose to New Mexico, you're probably fine if you're San Diego State. But man, it would have been nice to get that win on the road in Logan against Utah State.